Hello and welcome to The Week That Really Was with John McGurk and Sarah Ryan for this week ending the 4th of April 2025. I sincerely hope that my sound will be better this week than it was last week, and I apologise for that. Didn't find out until after the podcast was over that the computer had switched from one microphone to the other, which was ironic, Sarah, because at the very start of that episode I said I'm going to speak more slowly and more loudly so that people can hear me. Didn't really work out. Anyway, how are you?
People were upset with you in the comments about your sound. They really let you have it, didn't they? They were not.
Makes it different. Makes a difference from them being upset with me because of my views and my opinions. But I'll tell you who they're not upset with. They're not upset with you because I saw this video last week on the podcast. We mentioned very briefly that you've done this speech, this rethink or renew or whatever it is, something New Ideas Ireland thing. Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, Sarah did a speech. And then I see that it's on YouTube. And like Ryan's just piling up the views and the love and the affection. And you're becoming like, I used to think we were equals in this relationship, and now we're not.
That's what happens in male-female relationships, though, John. The woman always just ultimately outsmarts and outperforms the man. Sorry. I didn't even think it was kind of that good. Like, you know, the way you do that, you go to these speaking event things, and sometimes you're a bit, it just doesn't feel like your best work. But I was talking about adolescence and how we need to treat our boys better, and the messaging around young men and how they don't need to be trained out of being, we shouldn't be creating this narrative for young boys that we have to train things out of them or that they're somehow inherently bad to start with, and then with the proper coaching and the proper this and the proper that, they hopefully someday might shake off the shackles of toxic masculinity that are inherent in all of them and become good people. And I just, obviously, as we know from this podcast, object to that in the strongest of terms, and was talking about that and a couple of other things. But yeah, it's been online a lot.
Yeah, so you can go and check that out if you just Google Sarah's name. I don't know. Maybe I'll put it in a comment. You look for my username under YouTube. I'll put it in a comment if you want to go and find that video. I'll link to it. I'll do that tomorrow when this goes live. We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to continue that conversation with toxic masculinity very briefly. We're going to talk about, obviously, Tariffgate, Donald Trump's Liberation Day and everything that means, which means I will probably get accused of Trump derangement syndrome again, but what can you do? It's in the news. We're going to talk about Molly Malone's enormous brass breasts. We're going to talk about the government's speaking time row, and we'll get back to all of those topics. Sarah seems particularly eager to talk about Molly Malone, but we'll kick off by continuing the theme on adolescence and toxic masculinity, because that seems to have become, Sarah, like the new national religion of the United Kingdom. It's now going to be taught in all the schools. Keir Starmer's holding seminars on it. Like, what is with the Brits and going insane about stuff?
I don't know. Soon you won't be able to go into a restaurant without having your certificate to show that you've watched Adolescence.
It's depressingly true.
But Keir Starmer has also mentioned it twice, and it seems like he thinks it's a documentary. Did you notice that?
Yes.
It isn't. But no, it's just this kind of thing that has kind of captured the imagination of the wokerati, and it's nonsense. And nobody, I mean, you pointed out, and we don't need to go over it again, but like you pointed out last week that you'd watched it, and there was so much more that could be extrapolated from it in terms of messaging than just the boys are bad message. That doesn't seem to have caught on at all. But and I still haven't watched it, but I gather it's very good acting and all of that. But my point that I was making at that event, and which is obviously my opinion, is that the reason why it captures the imagination so much is because we live in an extremely anti-male culture, and it suits that narrative, and particularly anti-young male culture, and that's what it is, and it's another demonstration of, talk to your sons and train them and help them to not be what they, when really, from my understanding of it, it's, a troubled young man who is being bullied by girls, and who, obviously does something extremely wrong, but, it's just not really, not only does the attention that it's getting, is the attention that it's getting not warranted, but it actually doesn't really make much sense, because it's not in keeping with the actual messaging of that.
Yeah, but it's not only about young men. It is about young white men. And what's fascinating, obviously we've had this conversation. I don't want to go over it at length. But this is the fictional depiction of violence is the most unlikely real world kind you're going to get. It's a young kid from a loving marriage with a stable family and no upset in his home life. Whereas in actual reality, most of the violence, and not making any new points here, but most of the violence committed by young men in particular tends to come from kids from broken homes, from troubled backgrounds, and yet for some reason they depict this kid as being from the classic middle class family, and that is because the classic middle class family are the people they want to scare. That's just supposed to be scared by. Anyway, look, I think we'll park it there. We've said everything we want to say about it, but you made an interesting point to me this week during the week when you were saying you were watching, of all things, Alec Baldwin interviews and toxic femininity and all that sort of stuff. What are we talking about there?
Well, so I suppose, my wider point about Adolescence and Alec Baldwin then is that, I feel, and I've said it many times in this podcast, and it's easier for me to say this because I'm a woman than it is for you because you are a man, but that there's a constant anti-male narrative out there all the time, and this, rules for the goose and rules for the gander. And, it's easier for me to say that. And I hate it because I have two sons and I don't, I just don't want my sons to grow up in a world where they're just taught that they're inherently bad. But the double standards seem to be getting worse, not better. And the Alec Baldwin thing was this fascinating thing where he was on the red carpet with his wife recently and they're being interviewed about whatever they were at. And she started to talk. And then he kind of chimed in. Okay, maybe he interrupted her. But she was just like, when I'm talking, you don't speak. And the way she spoke to him, and I just thought, like, obviously that's really, really rude. But, and weird way to speak to your husband or your wife if it was the other way around. But if it was the other way around, The View and everybody would be talking about whether Ilaria Baldwin was in an abusive relationship and it was whether it was coercive control and, how dare he shut her down like that and talk to her like that, and everybody would be horrified. And it's just kind of like, not even breezed over or anything. It's just not even acknowledged that it can go either way. We have barely any domestic violence charities in Ireland for men, but the truth is that domestic violence against men is a real thing. There are women in Ireland, in the world, who beat the living hell out of their husband or boyfriend or whatever. It's not a foreign alien concept. It does exist. And the Alec Baldwin thing just like reinforced to me, and I've said it on the podcast loads of times, that like, we have this, you see a lot of it. We have such anti-male rhetoric all the time. And I just see people, I've mentioned before about working in wind farms, whatever, the lights are on, the house you're built in, loads of jobs that women don't do traditionally. Men do a lot of good stuff, and we never talk about that. We only talk about the negative. The narrative around men and boys is so toxic. Toxic male narrative is what we should be focusing on, not toxic masculinity.
I just on the domestic violence afflicting men thing, it is a real point, and nobody talks about it in the country at all. And I have some personal experience, not thankfully anything involving me, but I think enough time has passed now. Several years ago, I knew a person quite well who came out of a long-term relationship, and we all thought everything was fine. And one night, this guy breaks down and said, "I haven't told anyone, but like she was very violent. Like she was kicking him in the testicles randomly. Anytime they had an argument, she was just swinging that boot at him. She was hitting him. She was picking up implements and she was smacking him. And of course, in that kind of, I'm not saying that the answer to violence is to fight back. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, I think if you're a man in that situation, Sarah, particularly a normal guy who isn't prone to violence, every fiber of your body screams, whatever you do not hit the woman. You do not push her off. You do not get physical in any way. So in some ways it's worse because you feel like you can't run away. This is what he said. You feel like you can't run away. You feel like you can't fight back. And you feel like you can't tell anyone because I remember the relationship. She was a lot smaller than he was. He was about my size, a tall guy. And she was a little 5 foot something or other person. And she was bashing him. And maybe I've given too much detail now, and I hope I haven't. I don't think I have. But it's a real thing, and it's just, and I think it happens. I don't want to dramatize it, but I think it happens more in society than people are willing to admit. Put it that way.
But then, as well as the physical violence, and I know somebody who was in a relationship as well, who was having something similar to what you're describing, but also in terms of these kind of emotionally kind of, coercive control and things like that exists too. But even if it's just at its most base form, she's being absolutely obnoxious to her husband in front of the media, which obviously begs the question, if she's willing to be that obnoxious and demoralizing and dehumanizing to him in front of a camera, what's she like to him at home? And we would ask those questions, and there would be concern for her if it was the other way around. And nobody cares when it's it's this way.
Yes.
I don't know. It's a beat. It's a drum I'll just continue to beat because, I don't think it's right. And, men get a raw deal a lot of the time, I feel.
Well, look, speaking now about toxic masculinity and all this sort of stuff, Dublin City Council has moved swiftly this week to stamp it out. Because on Tuesday, which was, of course, April 1st, Dublin City Council put out a press release announcing that they have recruited a squad of Gardaí, or guards, not formerly members of a Garda Síochána, but a squad of guards, who will protect and police the Molly Malone statue, which, for those of you who don't know, is kind of at the bottom of Grafton Street. You turn left, it's up there a little bit. Because over the last number of years, the cleavage area, and Molly's wearing an old-fashioned corset in the statue, and the girls are pushed up. And the cleavage area has become shiny because it has become, Sarah, a habit of tourists in particular to go up and fondle her breasts for good luck. And we are told that this is unacceptable. That makes people uncomfortable. And Dublin City Council, for the summer, on a pilot scheme, is going to employ a roving squad of defenders of Molly Malone's honour and virtue to stop people from groping the breasts of the statue. So as a woman, do you feel that your dignity has been enhanced by this crackdown on male public lewdness?
What do you think? I just hope that nobody's getting their head kicked in on the other side of the quays while the police are busy stopping somebody from rubbing some metal.
I think it's fascinating. Because of what it says about our society. I think objectively, obviously it's stupid, right? We'll take for granted that if you are Dublin City Council and you put out a press release about this on April Fool's Day, and you're so conscious that it sounds stupid that you literally have to put at the bottom of the press release, they had to put at the bottom of the press release, this is not an April Fool's Day joke. Like, if you have to clarify
Are you still sure it's not?
I'm sure it's not, yeah. But if you have to clarify that your April Fool's Day joke is not an April Fool's Day joke, your story isn't an April Fool's Day joke, it's pretty damn ludicrous, right? Okay, but here's my point. I think, and those of you who read my piece on this during the week, and I recognize that won't be everybody who listens to this podcast. Some of you just listen to me and don't read all my thoughts every week, which is disgraceful, frankly. But I was saying this. Isn't it bizarre? Like, can you imagine if you were watching Reeling in the Years on RTE, right? And the setting was 1974. And it came up like in April. One of the big scandals was, men were spotted fondling the breasts of the Molly Malone statue, and a Catholic religious group demanded that this be stopped, and Dublin City Council responded by putting guards at the bottom of Grafton Street. Would you not think that's classic sexually repressed old Catholic Ireland, now, to be fair? Would that not be a perfect sort of Reeling in the Years story?
There was this, I did history in college, and there was this, must have been history. I did history in English, but it must have been one of the history classes anyway. There was a kind of a lecture on culture or whatever. And I always remember it covered this famous story from the Late Late Show from years and years past. And it was called the Nighty Scandal. And it was the Late Late Show did a piece on couples who were recently married or had been married a couple of years. And this thing where they asked them questions about, what will the wife's answer be, and see if the husband and the wife's answers will match up or whatever. Yeah. And one of the questions was, what nightie did she wear on her wedding night? The answers could be blue or white or green or whatever. And one of the wives' answers was, I wasn't wearing a nightie on my wedding night. And everybody was absolutely scandalized. Yes. And, it was a big, huge thing. And we all in this lecture laughed about how ye old Catholic Ireland was so fuddy-duddy and it was all so hilarious. But this is just that. But it's also more than that, John, because I also think that there's two worlds that exist and we're supposed to believe both of them or accept both of them, and they are actually contradictory. Either, climate change and all these things are like such serious threat and immediate and whatever. If they were looking back in the future, as they say they will at these times when we watch the world burn down around us, are they also supposing that the people down, if the world was burning down, wouldn't look back and go, why were they so concerned about somebody touching some metal tits then? Do you know what I mean? Or if the economy is about to tank because of Donald Trump and the whole world is economic world is about to fall apart or whatever, will they not look back and say, why were you caring about rubbing metal and men rubbing? Do you know what I mean? The two things don't make sense at the same time. Like, this is either, like, surely to God, Dublin City Council. I mean, I'm in town for work all the time. I see, like, the keys are, like, rough. I see people rough sleeping. I see a lot of derelict buildings around, the quays, all the way down the quays, drugs, loads of things. But this is a concern. So you can't tell me, it's just, these aren't serious people. You can't be serious. That's a thing that that's a thing that a society does where all of the other possible problems have been fixed. It's just a nonsense.
I agree with you, but I think there's more to it as well, because I think it is reflective of an illness that has taken hold in our society. I was thinking, and again, I refer back, and people who read my piece on this will be familiar with what I'm going to say, but I was thinking back to when I was a kid, and RTE used to show regularly, as did the other TV channels, the Carry On movies. Do you remember the Carry On movies? We're the same age. I'm sure you've watched a few of them. Maybe you didn't even like them, but the humor in those movies was all bawdy, and it was like men like really boobies. No, it's not. It's not. Wasn't really mine either. I'm not saying it was, but they could never be shown today because the humor in them is all very much about men objectifying women. Oh, he's distracted, but he's looking at her bosom rather than her face. That sort of stuff. And we have constructed this kind of society where there's no room for that anymore. Whether you like it or you don't, there is no room for sort of the public acknowledgement of male sexual desire. There's no room for the public acknowledgement that men like boobs, right? In essence. But then we've constructed this, because if you do that, you're kind of a toxic man. You're objectifying women. You are a menace in the public space. You're making young girls feel unsafe. You're all of these this language that we have conjured up and put into place to toxify the public expression of male sexuality. I'll put it that way. And yet, at the very same time, what have we done in private? In private, we have unleashed the most toxic form of extreme pornography, depravity, you name it, right there at the touch of a button for kids as young as 10 or 11 or 12 on the internet. And so we have taken what used to be sort of like a good-humored thing, like people rubbing as part of a statue for good luck in a kind of comedy way, and turned that into a public menace, while at the same time, teaching kids about fisting in their classes at the ages of 10, 11, 12, and 13. I think it is symptomatic of a complete inversion of our attitudes to sexuality that has become toxic in society, to the extent that if you want to look at all these bigger debates about toxic masculinity and young girls and the trans debate and what's fucking up our kids, basically, maybe I'm overthinking a ban on touching a statue, but I think it's part of that conversation. I think it's part of that conversation about how essentially we have toxified male sexuality in the public space while letting it run rampant across the internet and in the private space. And, you go into a sex education class and it's literally anything goes so long as you consent. But by the way, that statue didn't consent to having its boobs touched. It's insane.
Well, John, maybe that statue identifies as a real person.
That's true.
But I mean, it shouldn't need to be said, but like, it's a statue. It's actually a statue. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And people are,
it's not a sentient.
No. And come on. I just think it's a demonstration of hurty feelings. I mean, are we supposed to I mean, is it the case and is the argument that there was people, particularly supposedly women, walking down the street being offended by this?
I think the specific wording used by Mr. Yates of Dublin City Council was that it was provoking uncomfortable conversations, or words to that effect. But yeah, it was. I mean, they also said, in fairness, they also said they were worried about people falling and injuring themselves while attempting to touch the boobies. Right. So obviously, health and safety is a big thing in this country for everything, and so that was. Although I don't know why they couldn't solve that with a sign at the bottom of the statue saying "touch the boobies at your own risk," but that was part of the conversation. But yes, it was also part of the conversation that it was about acceptable standards of public behaviour.
In a city that is becoming increasingly more violent, acceptable standards of public behavior. I just think it's another demonstration of how we like to fix non-problems rather than real ones. That's my view.
I've been making that point for a long time. Fake problems. We invent fake problems. What is not a fake problem is the old Donald Trump tariffs, which were announced this week on Liberation Day, Wednesday, the 2nd of April. The tariffs were announced, and Ireland has been hit with a 20% tariff, which, according to, I believe, the ESRI, that oracle of all things economic, we only go to the ESRI, even though we really should have more economic think tanks, says that will result in a 7% contraction in Irish trade this year, all things else being equal. There's an awful lot of things we could talk about here, but let's start with just... just start with your opinion, because I haven't talked. Sarah and I genuinely haven't spoken to this all week. I don't know what your opinion is, so tell me.
Frankly, I think this is a conversation you should lead, John, because, as you know, you have a chronic and debilitating case of TDS. And so I'm sure you're absolutely delighted with the concept that, Donald Trump has done something bad for Ireland, and, the whole of Ireland is going to burn to the ground because of it. But obviously, it's not good for the Irish economy, but I mean, I suppose my overarching opinion on the whole thing is that this is what Donald Trump was going to do. This is what he was elected by the American people for. That this is what they wanted. This is what they voted for, and I think that it is going to have a damaging effect on our economy. But that's unfortunately not the job of Donald Trump to worry about the Irish economy.
No, but I'm interested in something you said there, in that you said this is what they voted him in to do. And I am fascinated by that, because, I mean, there will be those in the comments who say yes, that's true, that's what he was elected to do. And there will be others, I think, who voted for him. I was intrigued by a story in the Wall Street Journal this week, which basically said that there are lobbyists now for American business firms who are getting fired and getting canned because they told their businesses not to worry, that this wouldn't happen, that it would be like Trump's first term where he promised to do all this stuff and didn't do it. And now he's actually in the second time and he's doing it. He's Trump unleashed. He's unleashing the tariffs. But I'm interested in it because, as I said during the week, I would just like there to be some, what we might call, failure standards. And what's a failure standard? A failure standard is what we can agree in advance would constitute a failure of the policy. So, in other words, an agreed definition of what it is that the White House is trying to achieve with these tariffs, and how we can figure out if that's worked and when we can figure out that it's worked. And the reason I get upset about there not being failure standards is that because, there are two possible, you'll see them both, in fact, I suspect, in the comments under this on YouTube or other places, or on Gript, where you can see the podcast and comment underneath it. There are people who will say, on the one hand, tariffs are good. Tariffs are about bringing American jobs back home. It's about dealing with unfair trade practices overseas. It's about redressing the balance and reshoring American workers so that there are jobs in factories again in Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin and Michigan. And we're getting the American economy moving again without us being undercut by foreign workers. And tariffs are a good policy because of that. Okay, that's one. That is one line of argument. But then you also have the other one, which is Donald Trump is going to negotiate these tariffs away. He's playing hardball with Europe now, and they're going to come to the table, and Europe's going to do a deal, and we're going to get these tariffs lifted, and they're going to lift the tariffs that are currently in place on American goods and products, and that's going to increase the flow of American goods into Europe and European goods into the United States, and there's going to be more free trade. So I just want to know, which is it? Is it that tariffs are good and will bring back American jobs, or the tariffs are a negotiating strategy to get people to the table to negotiate to actually create more free trade? Because you can't, those two things are in mutual contradiction. You can't say it's some balance of them both, because it's not. Because you can't, if you're watering down the tariffs to negotiate them away, then you are watering down their effect. So I make no apologies for my TDS on this subject, because I think it is important that when you elect people to public office, they have clear policies and clear objectives for those policies, and we know what it is that they are trying to do, and have some idea what the failure standard would be if they get it wrong. So that's that. And then on the actual economics of the tariffs themselves, well, like everything the White House has said this week is along the lines of, we want equal trade. We want the trade balance to be 0-0 between Ireland and the US, so that we're buying as much from them as they're buying from us. But the reason that the United States has trade deficits with all these countries is because the United States is richer. And if I can buy more stuff from you, Sarah, than you can afford to buy from me, that means I'm richer than you. I'm not, by the way. But that is the reason the United States has all these trade deficits, and that's why he's implementing a policy that is effectively designed to make the American consumer poorer, which is why, as we speak, and I mean, we're recording this on Thursday, who knows what the markets will do on Friday, but on Thursday, the markets are collapsing, are reacting to this by collapsing. So, I mean, that's what I think.
Well, look, I don't agree with you when you say that those two things can't happen at the same time, because I think there can be an element of horse trading in something always. And I think that there could be two things at play. But at the end of the day...
That's the Fianna Fáil in you coming out now, to be fair. There's nothing they can say for us.
At the end of the day, when you're talking about, you know, Donald Trump and, you know, promising jobs in Wisconsin and promising jobs in this, whatever, like what I do have in common with Donald Trump is, like, I don't really care, nor should I, about jobs in Wisconsin. I care about jobs in Kildare and Navan and Naas and our economy, and how we react and respond to this, and how we insulate our economy, and who we have at the steering wheel of our economy to insulate us from the damage of this potentially, which inevitably there will be some. And what I was struck by in terms of our domestic politics and the responses to this is that there was a lot of, you know, at that event that you were speaking about at the beginning of the podcast that I was at, Cormac Lucy was also a speaker, and his talk was really good as well. People can watch it online, and he was talking about the economy and the Irish economy in the next 3 to 6 months, and he didn't have a very positive outlook for it. And so I noted that Micheál Martin and Simon Harris and Pascal Donoghue and I think today Michael McGrath as well, like there was a lot of kind of forlorn, downtrodden kind of hand wringing about what Donald Trump has done. And it felt a lot like people who are, you know, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it felt that there was a resignation to a point there that we are heading into a tricky economic time, and that it will all be blamed on this. And I think that that's very politically convenient, where in actual fact there has to be, and there will have been economic decisions, we'll say, that could have been made better, that would have insulated us, not fully, but somewhat from this. And spending that's happened over the last 2 to 3 years in particular, that would have made us better positioned to weather a storm that may or may not be coming in the next few months. And we didn't. And I think that it's really politically convenient for our politicians to start saying, oh, it was all Donald Trump what done it. And that might be true to a point, but it's not the full story. And I think that that's what they're going to try and do.
Yeah, but like, would you blame them?
Yes, of course.
Well, I know you would blame them. And that's not what I'm asking. Would you blame them for trying the old...
politicians be politicking. Yeah, I get that. But like at the same time, politicians be politicking, John, and what are we, pundits? And pundits be punditrying, and you know what I mean? So on, and so the world turns. So like if I see it, I'm going to call it in the same way as anybody else is, or not actually in the same way as anybody else is, because probably what will happen is we have a very cooperative media who will probably go along with the narrative that was all Donald Trump what did it, and not call the government to account on any of the decisions they could have made better in the last 2 years, because isn't that what they do too? But I'm going to say that, let the record show that for the last 2 years, many decisions for massive spending have been made that could have been made better, and maybe also not calling Donald Trump a gel, and other things that our government have done before they were re-elected, unfortunately, to make this potentially even ever so slightly more painful than it needs to be for Joe Public.
Well, I don't think you can hold the whole calling him a ghoul thing against them in the context of tariffs. And I'm not saying it was good to call him a ghoul. I'm saying that the guy just put tariffs on an island in the Pacific Ocean that's only populated by penguins. So I'm not entirely convinced that it was the calling him a ghoul what done it.
I'm not saying it's because of that, John, but I'm saying that I don't think that a smart politician would have ever put themselves in a position where they had created that kind of negativity in a relationship where that person had, even if they had a 5% chance of winning the election of the largest economy in the world, even a 5% chance. And he had a more than a 5% chance. And I don't mean to, rub your nose in it, but people like me knew that he was going to get elected way before people like you.
See, this is what you're doing now. You're putting me in a position where I have to sound like I'm defending this. In fairness to Simon Harris, who should not have said what he said, I believe he said it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he said it sort of in the aftermath of 2001, after the whole January the 6th business, when Donald Trump looked a very long way from returning to office. I don't think this is a thing he said. I'm not. What did I just say? I said I'm not defending him saying it or saying that he should have said it. I'm just saying that it is not true to say. It's not as if, in fairness to Simon Harris, you're talking about Donald Trump had a 5% chance to become next president. I'm saying that he shouldn't have said it, but he did not say it in the context of the last election. That's the only point I'm making. And in relation to
Gowl is okay, John. But hold on a second. Gowl is a memorable word, and that's why I remember it. But there was lots of negative posturing and virtue signaling and Kamala Harris memorabilia on desks and nonsense from people in Irish powerful political positions in Ireland who should have known better and who should have played smarter.
Yeah, well, more to the point, getting away from the whole what they did or didn't say about Donald Trump, because you're right about that. But I also want to point out, just for the record, because I'm always on the back foot on this stuff on this podcast, but it was me during the election. In fairness, there were some other writers as well. And there were people like Dan O'Brien, for example, writing this. And in fairness, I think Fionn Sheehan in the Independent as well. Like the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael manifestos and spending plans for the next 5 years, as put before the public in the general election, were a fantasy from day one. It was reliant on a particular level of economic growth being sustained. And they went and they sold people a bill of goods during the election. Based on what the pension will be in 5 years' time, and the tax cuts will be this, and the tax cuts will be the other. And now they're 3 months into a new government, an entirely foreseeable event, i.e., Donald Trump becoming president of the United States and imposing tariffs on trade. Donald Trump was talking about tariffs on trade in the 1980s. He's a true believer in tariffs on trade. That is the one thing. Throughout his entire career, you might say he's vacillated on a number of issues. Tariffs has been his number one issue. Donald Trump becoming president of the United States and putting tariffs on trade, it was a foreseeable event before the election. And yet their manifestos and their plans for the next 5 years were based essentially on this not happening and everything being plain sailing. And it is a disgrace that was allowed to happen. And the only reason by that it was allowed to happen is because you know what the Irish opposition parties did? They were like, grand, well, if you're spending this much, we'll spend a bit more. Because that's the only imagination they had. And they weren't able to challenge the government to say your spending plans are a fantasy. They're much, much, much too optimistic, and you're going to have to pull them in. And my final point on this, because I've monopolized the conversation for a little bit, is that isn't it telling that they're out now saying we'll have to cut back on the old tax cuts, we'll have to cut back on the welfare increases, and they're targeting all this and everything. And not one of them has said, do you know now with these Trump tariffs, we might have to shave a few million off the old NGO budget and maybe bring a few fewer people into the country and house them in hotels. Like that's not up for discussion. It's your tax cuts and your welfare payments that are going to get the chop on foot of what old Trumpy has done in the White House.
Well, hold on. We know, in fairness, I mentioned actually at that event as well that we do know that they did defund one NGO, wasn't it? It was the NGO that was designed to have oversight and do checks on NGOs. So yes, they did get rid of one. Fair play to them. But yes, you're absolutely right that I don't say this often enough, but I actually think our opposition is worse. Because
they're 100 times worse.
They should know better. And the government does some things right. And, some things work. Lots of things in Ireland work, in fairness. And the government are doing some things right, and the opposition are doing absolutely nothing right. Since the new government has been, like, what comes to mind is a proposal that you have to do your driving test every year or something dumb like that. And they've been fighting about where they sit and screaming and roaring, like whatever, for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. That's the opposition we got. We are so underserved and unlucky and whatever with our opposition. It's just not even true.
They are an abomination. It's the worst start to a Dáil term by an opposition in my lifetime, and I think in the history of the state. Obviously, I think in the history of the state, I don't think there's ever been a worse start to a Dáil term by an opposition. Before we move off tariffs, I want to talk to you about something, because I get emails in from readers all the time, fighting with me on this and other topics. I say fighting. I hope it's all in good humour, and I hope that the emails I quote are in good humour. But a guy emails me in this week, and essentially he says, John, what you're missing in this whole Trump tariffs thing is that it'll be harmful to Ireland, but that's a good thing because of essentially what I've just been talking about. That, Trump knows that Europe needs a good, short, sharp shock, and that will wake them up and they'll stop spending money on NGOs and migrants and immigration, and a good economic shock might be what it needs to wake Europe up. And I just thought to myself, I understand where you're coming from, buddy, but like, you got to be desperate. You got to be really desperate if you start hoping for recessions in your own country to kind of be a catalyst for the kind of political change that you want. Because I just don't see that happening. But I'll ask your opinion on it anyway, because there's a lot of people I think who feel that way, particularly on the sort of right of Irish politics.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with that, because I think there's no way of knowing what the effects of a sharp shock would be on our economy. And the truth is that, I'm old enough to remember 2008. You are too. We were talking about this the other day. It was awful. And another thing that people kind of don't think about or whatever, but when the economy tanks in a country or whatever, it has big consequences that are, far reaching. People die. The rates of people dying goes up. People lose their homes. Children's entire childhoods are lost while their parents scramble to try and hold on to, their roof over their head or whatever. It's got a lot of societal effects. And, I remember 2008, and I know people who emerged very, very, very badly beaten, financially from that. And it had a massive consequence for their lives and their families and whatever. So I would never want that to happen, because there's, once you let the genie out of the lamp or whatever, there's no way of putting it back. You don't know what the consequences will be, how it will affect, what will happen. And no, I don't think you should ever wish for that.
Yeah. I think it's all about this. I keep saying this meme on the internet, and I write about this in my email to the readers, to the subscribers. So if you're a Gript subscriber, paying subscriber, you will have gotten it. But I'll share a little bit of it here. I keep seeing this meme online. I'm sure you've seen it, Sarah. It's the one that kind of goes, strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create bad times, and bad times create strong men. Have you seen that one?
No.
Okay, well, I keep seeing it. And like, I kind of feel like there's a lot of it about at the moment of people kind of feeling that we're at this stage where Europe and the West in particular has been governed by weak men. And I include women in that. I use men because that's what the meme says, for a very, very long time. And that what I'd call this view, and this is particularly if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, which I don't recommend people do anymore, but if you do, spend a lot of time on Twitter, you will see a lot of this sort of this attitude that Europe and the United States and the broader West is heading towards a complete crisis, demographic crisis, an economic crisis, an immigration crisis, an identity crisis, and that essentially the apocalypse is coming, and that it's all the fault of the people in power. And by the way, I have to say, I would agree with a lot of that analysis. I really would. But then that kind of tips over, and I've seen a little bit of it in the tariff conversation in relation to the email I just described, that kind of like, it's almost to be welcomed if we can accelerate that apocalypse and have our reckoning, and hopefully something better will emerge from the ashes. And I keep seeing that kind of line of thinking. And like, I get a lot of emails every week, I get a lot of comments on the articles I write, and it's a theme I keep coming through. And it scares me a little bit, that kind of almost eagerness for, what we might call the burn it all down approach, where we're kind of almost rooting for the worst to happen so that the phoenix might rise from the ashes. And as you say, I lived through 2008 as well. And the most immediate consequence of any of this in Ireland would be a Sinn Féin government propped up by the Labour Party and the Social Democrats. And good luck if you think that's going to give you some kind of nationalist revolution, folks.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that I saw a really interesting thing talk by this, I can't remember, but it's a concept that I think about quite a lot now. And it's about how, people are too newsed and too, thinking about this, getting extremely vexed about something that happened in Midnight, Mississippi last week, when really, 150 years ago or 200 years ago, you really only cared about your own town. And that it's not just, we have a lot of people who are, and I have spoken before about Jordan Peterson and his 12 rules for life. And, one of the reasons why I really liked it was one of the rules is, clean your room, make your bed and clean your room. In other words, you're really not in a position to comment on world events if you can't even keep your own bedroom in order. You know what I mean? And so I think people get very fixated on the wider thing, and they think that, it'd be great if this happened, and but they don't really have any concept of the damage that those kind of things have done. And in a lot of cases, what they could do to change the world is much more local, and is much more if they, look after themselves, worry about themselves, in a nice way, and, not be wishing about massive global events, that ultimately might not be real. And that goes back to my point about the tariffs, is that I care about Ireland, I care about Dublin, I care about, whether, and what people should care about is Dublin, Ireland for now, whether or not somebody's going to kick your head in if you go into town to go to dinner, tourism being down by 30%. These are the things that really matter in Ireland right now. And I think it's getting distracted about the world economy and whatever. I'm not saying those things aren't important and aren't real, but for the most part, the things that are going to damage your life are things that are all around you, and not the things that are that global.
Well, there's two things that come to mind, but things that are much more local, and I think much more pressing this week than the conversation we're having, important though it is. And one you just mentioned, which is the collapse in tourism figures again. Because I'm just thinking there that, one of the things that Donald Trump can put tariffs on is tourism. And yet this country has systemically dismantled its tourist industry to the extent that, we're 30% down year on year. And the second one,
a 30% is just so big. It's, it's kind of beyond. It's not 3%, it's 30. It's just wild, and it got not that much attention.
No, it didn't. I wrote a piece on it that got a lot of people read it because there's a lot of anger about this. But this is another thing, because this brings you on to my other point, where the media is spending all this time on Trump tariffs, and I understand why. A 7% drop in Irish trade is a big story. I am not saying that the media shouldn't be covering it. Of course they are. Of course they should. Yeah. But why isn't a 30% drop in tourism? Why didn't that get a fraction of the coverage? And at the same time as that's happening, we learned this week that Radio Telefís Éireann, that national jewel in the crown, our national broadcaster, is to launch a new, what they call a strand of its programming called Clarity, RTE Clarity, which is going to, Sarah, you'll be glad to know, it's going to crack down on the likes of you and me. All these podcasters online and tweeters and people play acting at being serious journalists and not sitting in Montrose behind a microphone. And it's going to deal with fake news and misinformation and disinformation. It's going to tell the Irish people what for and what to look out for. And I'm just sitting here thinking, you guys...
And it's run by RTE. Next up, we'll have Mike Tyson for a seminar on respecting women and violence.
It's just... I don't know. Some people ask me on a regular basis, how many people listen to your podcast now? Truth, honest to God, truth is, we don't know. We know it's, well over 20,000 a week, and we really appreciate that. But we don't know how many it is. But if you are one of those people listening, then you are in a select club, because you're not one of those people. And we all know them. They're in our lives. I'm quite closely related to someone who literally see the world still through the eyes of the 6-1 News. That's what they do. They sit down in the evening, they turn on the 6-1 News, and you see, I don't even know who presents the 6-1 News anymore because I never watch it. But somebody sits there and tells you the world through your camera, through the prism of RTE. And I would recommend, if you are not one of those people, who gets your news from RTE, it actually, you need to sit down some evening and watch the 6 and the 9 News and understand just how filtered that is, just what a different understanding of the world you're getting from these people who, and I mean, I'm not saying what they're saying is always false. I'm saying that they're advancing a particular understanding of the world. They're emphasizing some things, de-emphasizing others, and they're always constructing this narrative of the world, and then they're talking about clarity. They exist to make things unclear, and they exist to obfuscate. I'll end my rant. I suspect listeners agree.
That's kind of a cohort of Irish people, isn't it? Who, like you say, get their news from RTE, and they have, it's like stabilitarians that I've talked about. They always vote a certain way. They get their news from RTE. They always have VHI healthcare, and Aircom is their phone provider, and they think TCP cures everything if you just gargle with it. It's just kind of like the Irish kind of classic bog standard Irish person. But it matters, and it matters more because they vote based on what they see on RTE. Unfortunately,
yes, they do,
and they don't realize. Like I'd often have somebody come up to me in some situation, either socially or whatever, and they don't think about anything until they're faced with an event. So either they have a family member, usually a parent, who starts to interact more with the health service. That changes their view of things, because up until now they've had VHI and they go to the VHI clinic because they broke their ankle, but they never really. The concept of trolleys and all that is kind of something they read about on the news, but they've never actually seen it with their own eyes. Or, they see something or something happens where they realize that, things might not be as they seem, or something. There's an event that changes their perspective. But up until then, things are fine. They have a house, they got a mortgage, they probably have a decent job, and they're stabilitarians. Everything's stable. Everything's fine as far as they're concerned. And I don't know what the answer to that is. And that right there is why some people want there to be a big event, like an economy crash, because they think that that's the only thing that will shake those kind of people out of their inertia, and that will have political consequence. But I think that's too high a price to pay.
I mean, if you find yourself wishing for people's lives to be essentially ruined to wake them up, I do it, like, you're a bit like the Greens. There are Greens out there, not the ones involved in electoral politics, who will talk to you enthusiastically, and the eyes get
only one of them
glazed. There's one Green in Dublin. I'm not talking about the elected ones. I'm talking about the activists. And you engage them in debate, and you talk about, like, you really believe in degrowth, and degrowth is this idea that the Greens have, that the economy should shrink, that we should all get poorer and reconnect with nature. And they're like, yes, it's the only way we can save the planet is to have degrowth, which is just a fancy way of saying crashing the economy. And they genuinely believe that if we can just make everyone poorer, eventually we'll get over the shock and we'll go back to living in our huts in the trees and dancing around with the monkeys and having the rabbits frolic around our feet and growing our cabbage and eating it. And it's just a kind of, what that has in common with some of the stuff I'm seeing on the right is this desire to destroy the world to remake it. But the world is people. You're actively rooting for people to have it worse so that they'll wake up and see things your way. Well, people have ears, and if they figure out that you're rooting for them to be worse off, they're not going to turn your way. They're going to turn some other way. I do remember during the 2008 recession. I mean, I think, do you remember it was one of those hotels behind Trinity College where I think was Conor Lenihan, one of the ministers, who was sent out, and it was to defend kind of pension and medical card cuts. Do you remember that? I think they were taking away the means tested medical card from pensioners, who, by the way, should never have had a medical card to begin with. The means tested medical card, they were basically trying to means test it so that wealthy pensioners wouldn't have the medical card anymore. And there was utter war. I think everyone who's interested in politics remembers the event that I'm talking about.
Yeah, they marched, didn't they? They marched.
Yeah. So the point is, the kind of thing you're talking about, the kind of mass political awakening of what you might call normal folks who, I mean, up until that point in 2011, were reliable Fianna Fáil voters, most of them. And that broke them away. They never voted for Fianna Fáil again after that, which is why Fianna Fáil can now win elections with 22, 23%, whatever they got the last time, instead of the 40% they used to get. So that kind of mass awakening can happen. But of course, in Ireland, what happened? They all marched over and voted for Fine Gael and Labour, and then some of them drifted off to Sinn Féin, and, we are where we are. It doesn't always work out the way you think it will. There are people in this country who dreamed for decades of the day that Fianna Fáil would be smashed into smithereens and have 20% of the vote and would never be in power again. And lo and behold, here it is with 20% of the vote in power again. Things don't always work out the way you think they're going to.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, like I said, people in recessions suffer tremendously, and children's entire childhoods are gone, and poverty and loss, and parents who are stressed out of their minds. So there's other ways, slower, but other ways.
Before we go, Ben wrote a piece there on Thursday that I thought was very interesting, and I wanted your opinion on it. And it's about this whole Oireachtas speaking time row. And Ben makes the point that obviously the row, for those of you who don't know or whose eyes glazed over weeks ago, is essentially that the government have agreed to give 6 minutes extra twice a week, so it's 12 minutes a week, to government backbenchers to ask questions of ministers. And the opposition say this is an outrage, that government TDs shouldn't be acting like opposition TDs and questioning ministers, and so on and so forth. And Ben wrote a piece in which he basically says, that's actually a good thing. Because if you look at every other parliamentary system in the world, if you look at, for example, and the example he gives is Westminster, where oftentimes government backbenchers are the people who give governments the most trouble. He's saying we should give this a chance because it might actually let some Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backbenchers develop a personality and stand up for themselves. And I just wondered, how likely do you think that is to happen?
Unlikely. No, because I think that's not really that's a nice concept. What this will end up being is a way for independent TDs who are propping up the government, who shall remain nameless, to posture themselves as still being independent and speak to the gallery of their voters and make it seem like they're still one of them while still taking the big jobs and the better money. That's what this is about. It's not about, calling the government to account in any real way. It's nothing of the sort. It'll be an orchestrated thing where they'll ask the questions that everybody know. You know what I mean? I mean, give it a chance, fine. Well, we don't really have any choice, do we? But if only that were true, and if only that could happen, I'd be all for it. But I don't think that that's what this is going to be.
All right. Well, look, Ben's piece is there on Gript. You'll find it. I can't remember what it's called, but if you just go into Ben's profile, you'll be able to find it. I think it's a good piece if you're interested in politics, worth reading. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but I wanted to flag that. And also,
we
him
live
and
in hope.
Fatima had a
We
long
can live in hope. We
yes,
live in
him
hope.
and Fatima had a long conversation this week. And if you're interested in dating tips, Fatima did a whole spiel about what women are looking for in men and all that sort of stuff, which may interest you if you're one of the incels that are out there, we're told. Although I don't think there's many of them as people say there are. All right, Sarah, have you anything else to add to us before we leave?
No.
All right, well then we will leave it at that for another week. I've been John, she's been Sarah. This has been the week that really was. I hope my sound was better. If it wasn't, feel free to just email me and give me loads of abuse, more than you usually do. And we'll be back next week. Until then, have a great time. See you soon. Bye.